We're all chasing that unicorn, right? That book or movie that's so scary we want to sleep with the lights on for a week. But is that the most important thing in horror? I've said it before, as much as I love horror, and I do, I have an entire channel dedicated to the genre, but as much as I love it, I'm also pretty desensitized to it. I've made videos about the most disturbing books of all time, but as a rule, the ones I picked are more intellectually disturbing than actually scary. Same goes for some of the extreme horror movies we've talked about, like a Serbian film or Man Behind the Sun. Lord knows those can get under your skin a bit, especially if you're not as jaded as I am, but they're not likely to really give you the kind of scare we're talking about. So let me start by just getting this right out in the open right here at the start. I haven't found it yet. I've spent my entire adult life so far, and much of my childhood, searching for that elusive book or movie that really scares me, but I've come up empty. Sure, some come closer than others, but nothing's ever really made me want to sleep with the lights on. If you think you've got a contender though, do be sure to leave me a comment. Just because I haven't found it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist, so I want to hear all y'all's recommendations. While you're at it, be sure to like and subscribe and all that good stuff to help me grow this channel. But getting back to the topic at hand, this raises an important question. Does horror actually need to be scary? The genre is called horror for a reason. We're one of the only genres entirely dedicated to a specific emotion, the only other one I can think of being comedy. So a quick and easy answer might be that of course horror needs to be scary because that's the whole point. But I'm not so sure. For one thing, I love horror movies even when they don't quite manage to give me the good scare. So just from personal experience, there's obviously something worthwhile in the genre, even if it fails to evoke the emotion for which it's named. But I think it's worth taking a minute to dig a little deeper and think about what makes for effective horror and whether it really needs to be scary or not. One thing I think is worth considering is the number of horror comedies on the market. We have great movies like Shaun of the Dead, Dead and Breakfast, Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, and about a million others that have all of the tropes of the horror genre and focus on truly horrifying situations, and yet they're designed to make us laugh far more than to make us afraid. It's also worth looking outside the horror genre. If evoking fear is the defining characteristic of a horror movie, then wouldn't certain political documentaries be reclassified as horror movies? So if there are some titles within the horror genre, or at least partially within the horror genre, that aren't supposed to actually scare us, and plenty of other titles that do scare us even though we'd never put them in the horror genre, what are we supposed to make of all this? It strikes me a little bit strange that if I read or watch a comedy and it doesn't make me laugh, I largely consider it a failure. Yeah, there are some comedies that are so deep on some other level that I can enjoy them even if I don't find them funny, but at the very least, the unfunny comedy fails as a comedy. Horror seems different though. I'm pretty much never scared by them, and absolutely never scared in the sense of that deep kind of scare that I'm really looking for. But I don't find them to be failures, even as examples of the horror genre. So what gives? Horror and comedy are similar in that both have emotions at their core, but I think there's a key distinction. It seems to me that there are two ways for something to be effective as horror. It can either evoke horror, or it can be about horror. Comedy, though, doesn't seem to have that exception. In comedy, either it's funny, either it makes you laugh, or it's not a good comedy. Let me illustrate by example. One of my favorite horror movies of all time is John Carpenter's The Thing. Did that movie scare me? It did not. But it presented a situation I can recognize as horrific, and I can think intellectually about what it has to say about that horrifying situation. I may not actually be afraid that the thing is out there waiting to get me, but I can completely understand that horror as a metaphor for the horror that the people in our lives might not turn out to be who we think they are. Betrayal is one of the most psychologically devastating things people can experience, so when someone we knew and trusted, maybe even loved, suddenly reveals himself or herself to have been untrustworthy all along, that can really take us apart. To me, that's the horror in a movie like The Thing. It's not about The Thing. The Thing is a cinematic construct that frames a psychologically terrifying experience into a narratively satisfying and comprehensible format. The same goes for plenty of other horror books and movies. Zombies, for instance, aren't necessarily scary in their own right, but I think they have something to tell us about the fears related to mob behavior. Ghosts tell us something about our fears of death and uncertainty about the afterlife. Vampires and werewolves tell us something about our darker hungers and desires. I'm not even saying necessarily that these are the only metaphorical interpretations of these monsters. My point simply is that the horror genre gives us an opportunity to think about horrifying things, even if it doesn't necessarily horrify us in the moment. When I've listened to or participated in conversations about horror not being scary enough in the past, I've noticed a lot of common themes that people object to. The claim a lot of people seem to make is that horror isn't scary anymore, with the implication being that it used to be scarier than it is now. I don't really know whether that's the case, but I do think there are several common threads to those discussions that are worth considering. The first thing is jump scares. And it's a fair complaint, because jump scares don't actually scare us. They startle us. And there's a world of difference between being so scared you feel like you need to carry a firearm just to get up and go to the bathroom at night, and being momentarily startled by a loud noise. But I don't actually hate jump scares. I do think they're overused and often lazy, but when done properly, they do have their place in horror. Particularly in horror movies and video games, though I've even seen some people attempt them in written horror. At some point in the future, I'll analyze the jump scare in more detail, but for now, suffice it to say that jump scares don't actually build fear and tension, they release it. Other people complain about poorly marketed horror movies, or a related topic, the number of remakes out there. And that's fair enough too. Plenty of horror movies, and it's also true of books, though to a lesser extent, have been marketed as something rather different from what they really are. A good example of this is Crimson Peak. When I saw the trailer, I expected a scary, or at least creepy, haunted house movie. Instead, I got a gothic romance. Does that make it a bad movie? Not at all. I actually liked it on a certain level. But audiences who went in expecting to be scared were, of course, sorely disappointed. A related topic is remakes. I'm certainly among those who complain about the number of remakes out there. Every once in a while a remake comes along that actually improves upon the original, or at least takes it in an interesting new direction, but most of the time they're just inferior copies of a great work from the past. The 1998 remake of Psycho was essentially just a shot-for-shot remake of Hitchcock's original masterpiece. The same can be said of the 2006 remake of The Omen. It's not exactly that these are terrible films, but of course they're not going to be all that scary. After all, we've already seen them before. Even when the remakes aren't quite as faithful to the source material, they're often going to struggle uphill to actually scare the audience, simply because we already know too much about whatever the big bad happens to be. And that brings us to another related topic. The fact of the matter is, audiences have simply seen too much. Especially hardcore horror audiences like myself, and I assume many of you who are watching. Back in the 1930s, the Universal monsters were unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Even today they're great movies, but we already know all their tricks, so they're unlikely to be frightening. Every time a new horror story comes out, whether in print or on the screen, some new corner of the genre gets explored, and creators have to keep trying harder and harder to find new ways to frighten audiences. Every generation of horror seems to have to raise the stakes compared to its predecessors. Cannibal Holocaust, for example, sent shockwaves through the cinematic world when it first came out in 1980. Many countries even banned it. But if you watch it now, after having seen movies like A Serbian Film and The Human Centipede and Martyrs, or hell, even after having seen comparatively milder films like Hostel or the Saw movies, it's just not all that impressive anymore. Nor is it the case only for extreme horror. The Blair Witch Project, when it first came out in 1999, terrified a lot of people, in part because of its revolutionary marketing, of which I'm sure Orson Welles would have been extraordinarily proud, but also because the movie itself wasn't quite like anything we'd ever seen before. Now, found footage horror movies are a dime a dozen. We have the Rec movies, Cloverfield, the Paranormal Activity franchise, and plenty more. Every once in a while, one like Host comes along that manages to do something a little different, but it gets harder and harder for creators to find that new thing simply because so much has already been done. Audiences have gotten jaded. But while I've been discussing why horror doesn't always scare us anymore, I think I've also been proving my other point that horror doesn't need to necessarily be scary as long as it presents scary. Some of the films I mentioned, while I didn't find them all that scary, are among my favorites. Looking at just those found footage movies I mentioned, even after having seen Blair Witch, I have to say I loved the first Paranormal Activity movie. Cloverfield was a lot of fun, and the first two Rec movies are among my very favorite films. One of the things I find important is that even if these films don't scare me after the credits roll and the lights come back on, they manage to maintain enough suspense or tension throughout the film that they can at least evoke a sort of low-level fear during the viewing experience. When you watch the Rec movies, you're always wondering what you're going to see the next time the camera moves. When you watch Paranormal Activity, you're going to be a bit weirded out by some of the things you see, even though they're not over-the-top special effects. In fact, probably because they're not over-the-top special effects. For the time while you're immersed in the story, you're invested in the horror of the situation. It helps, also, when you genuinely care about the characters, because even if horror might not scare you deeply and make you fear for your own safety after you're done reading or watching, it can and should make you care about what happens to the characters. Another recent-ish favorite of mine is a movie called Pontypool, which I don't think nearly enough people have seen. It's effective because it maintains tension throughout. You know something horrible is going on, but you're only learning about it alongside the characters. But perhaps even more importantly, its filmmaking is tight and intimate, giving you the chance to really get to know and like the characters to the point that you really care what's going to happen to them by the end. Grady Hendrix managed to do the same thing in print in his book, The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. It seems like a silly book based on the title, and there is plenty of humor within it, but I'll be damned if there aren't a couple scenes that really get the heart racing and keep you turning those pages because the characters have become so important to the reader that you just can't help but feel the tension. For a lot of people, I think haunted houses play with the same kind of scariness, even if they are mostly just jump scares. No one is actually afraid of the monsters. No one is traumatized by walking through a haunted house. But there is a certain tension while you're walking through because you know that at some point you're going to turn a corner, maybe not this corner, but maybe the next one or the one after, and there's going to be a damn chainsaw clown or something right in your face. So far, I've been treating books and movies as somewhat interchangeable for the purpose of this discussion, but I think there are also some important differences. Books and movies, and for that matter comics, games, music, and anything else, have different ways of trying to scare an audience. In a book, you don't get to experience the music gradually building tension. You don't get the jump scares, although a few books have tried. You don't get the crazy visuals. Instead, you get intimacy with the characters. Horror on the page, if it's to be effective, largely has to be internal, because the narration can take you directly into the character's mind, and you can feel what the character feels. Horror on screen is exactly the opposite. Though you may like and relate to a character, there's no real way to get inside their head, unless there's a voiceover monologue or something, but that's likely to be far more distracting than effective. So you don't get the opportunity to feel the character's horror for yourself. Instead, the film will use all those techniques the books don't have to try and find a way to inflict the fear directly on the passive viewer. Games manage to exist somewhere in the middle, because they usually don't have the depth of characterization of a good book or even a movie, but they compensate by combining the auditory and visual tools of the cinema with the immersion of the novel by placing the player in the role of main character. That's somewhat true of any game, but I think it's doubly true of the VR horror games like I talked about in my video about the horror games available for the Oculus Quest, to which there's a link down in the What's It, right along with all the other links and information you need to get more information about this topic or to stay up to date about my various other projects. That little advertisement out of the way, I recently had a conversation with Colton Scrivener, a psychological researcher at the University of Chicago. That particular conversation was off the record, so I won't be sharing all the details, but I will probably be making a video discussing some more of his work in the near future as well, because he's been doing some fascinating research on morbid curiosity and horror as a sort of defense against anxiety. One of the ideas he mentioned is that horror fans are actually more resilient against stress and anxiety than non-horror fans, according to some of his research, and he thinks part of the reason is that horror provides us with a safe place to deal with those anxieties. We know the horror story is fiction, so it doesn't actually scare us at that deep, primal level, but while watching it, it allows us to experience some of the psychophysiological effects of a genuine horror in a controlled environment, which might actually make us more resilient against real horror when it does come into our lives. Seen in that light, maybe we shouldn't expect horror movies to actually scare the bejesus out of us. Maybe we should be happy that we get some of the best books and movies in the world, and they can be tense and exciting and thought-provoking and fun while we're reading or watching, but we can also be grateful that they don't traumatize us to the point that we want to sleep with the lights on. That's probably the sane answer, but for me, I'm still hoping to find that unicorn that can scare me so much that I want to pull what's left of my hair out in complete and utter terror. That brings us to the close of yet another video. Alas, parting is such sweet sorrow. Do be sure to like, share, subscribe, and all that wonderful stuff. Make sure you ring that notification bell, leave me a comment, all that. And until next time, take care and stay scared.